Robert also began the difficult work of trying to rebuild relationships with his own adult children. He called his daughter Emily, and instead of making excuses or defending his past choices, he simply apologized with raw honesty. "Emily, I failed you as a father. I chose work over you, repeatedly, for your entire childhood. I missed your concerts, your games, your graduation, your wedding. I was physically absent and emotionally unavailable. I can't change the past, but I want to try to do better now, if you'll give me that chance. I understand if you can't forgive me. I probably wouldn't forgive me either." The conversation was painful and brutally honest, years of hurt spilling out in tears and raised voices and long silences. Emily told him about the countless times she'd looked for him in the audience and he wasn't there, about feeling like she had to earn his attention through perfect grades and achievements, about her wedding day when he'd spent half the reception on his phone closing a deal, about the resentment she'd carried for decades. But it was also the beginning of healing. Emily, now 30 years old and pregnant with her first child, had been waiting her whole life for her father to actually see her, to acknowledge his failures, to be vulnerable enough to admit fault without defensiveness. His willingness to be that vulnerable, to accept responsibility, opened a door that had been closed for decades. They began meeting for coffee once a week. The conversations were sometimes uncomfortable, often emotional, but they were real in a way their relationship had never been before. When Emily went into labor 3 months later, she called Robert, and he dropped everything, canceled meetings, rescheduled a board presentation, and sat with her through 12 hours of labor, holding her hand, being present for the birth of his granddaughter in a way he'd never been present for her own birth. One morning, 6 months into Robert's volunteering, he arrived at Chen Technologies to find a small package on his desk with a note in careful handwriting. "Thank you for seeing what matters. Thomas." Inside was a hand-carved wooden box, simple but absolutely beautiful, clearly made with tremendous skill and care. The wood was smooth and perfectly joined, the lid fitting precisely, the interior lined with soft felt. Robert later learned that Thomas had spent weeks making it in the home's small wood shop, working on it during his lunch breaks, using his limited free time to create something meaningful. The gift, probably worth $50 in materials, but priceless in time and effort and heart, meant more to Robert than the expensive watches and golf club memberships and luxury items he'd received over the years from business associates trying to curry favor. He kept the box on his desk, not hidden in a drawer, but prominently displayed, a daily reminder of what Thomas had taught him about value and worth and what really matters in life. Visitors would sometimes comment on it, asking where he'd gotten such a beautiful piece. "A friend made it for me," Robert would say simply, and the word friend, referring to his janitor, still felt revolutionary and right. He used the box to store the most important things: the photo of his granddaughter, letters from Emily, drawings from the children at Sunshine Home. The box became a repository for what actually mattered, as opposed to the financial documents and contracts and stock certificates that filled his other drawers. Robert also began changing how Chen Technologies operated from the inside. He established a company-wide volunteer program, encouraging all employees to spend paid time, 4 hours per month, working with community organizations of their choice. He increased wages for maintenance and support staff by 25%, understanding now that these were human beings with lives and families and struggles, not just line items in a budget to be minimized. He created a scholarship fund specifically for children from foster care and group homes, targeting kids from Sunshine Home and similar facilities, providing full rides to college for young people who had aged out of the system. The board of directors initially pushed back hard on some of these initiatives, concerned about their impact on the bottom line and shareholder value. Robert's response surprised them and would have shocked his former self. "Our purpose isn't just to maximize shareholder value," he said firmly at a contentious board meeting. "It's to create genuine value in the world, for our customers, our employees, our communities. If we're not making the world measurably better, if we're not lifting people up, then what's the point of our success? What's it all for?" It was a philosophy that would have been unthinkable to Robert 2 years earlier. But Thomas Martinez had taught him that wealth without purpose was just accumulated emptiness, that success without meaning was just societally sanctioned failure. Some board members resigned in protest, unable to accept this new direction. Others, however, were inspired by Robert's evolving vision and became passionate champions of the changes. The company culture began to shift, slowly, imperfectly, but noticeably. Employees started talking about meaning and purpose, not just compensation and advancement. One Sunday afternoon at Sunshine Home, about a year after Robert's first visit, he sat on a bench in the playground watching Thomas push a young girl on a swing. The girl's laughter rang out across the yard, pure, joyful, unself-conscious, and Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine contentment. Not the temporary satisfaction of closing a deal or the fleeting pleasure of acquiring something new, but deep, lasting contentment. The sense that he was exactly where he should be, doing exactly what mattered, being exactly who he was meant to be. Thomas joined him on the bench after the girl ran off to play with friends. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the children play, before Robert spoke. "I owe you an apology, Thomas." "For what?" Thomas asked, genuinely surprised. "For my question when I first came here, asking how you could afford to be so generous. It was patronizing and insulting. It implied that generosity is something only wealthy people can practice, that your gift was somehow less valuable because of your income level." "You didn't know any better," Thomas said without judgment or resentment. "Most people assume that money enables generosity. But it's actually the opposite. Generosity is a habit of the heart that has absolutely nothing to do with the size of your bank account. Some of the most genuinely generous people I know have almost nothing materially. Some of the stingiest, most miserly people I know are billionaires." "Like I was," Robert said quietly, acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. "You were playing the game you thought you were supposed to play," Thomas replied with understanding. The culture of wealth often teaches people to accumulate rather than circulate, to hoard rather than share, to protect rather than give. Breaking free from that takes real courage. Robert asked the question that had been on his mind. "Thomas, when did you learn to be this generous? Was it always natural for you, or did someone teach you?" Thomas laughed softly, the sound carrying both joy and sadness. "Not all natural. When I was young, I was as selfish as anyone. I wanted more money, a nicer car, a bigger house, all the things society tells us to pursue. But then I married Rosa, and she taught me to see the world completely differently." "How did she do that?" "Mostly by example, by living what she believed. She grew up in desperate poverty in Guatemala, and she understood something that I, growing up middle class in America, didn't: that people need each other to survive, that community is more valuable than property, that we're all deeply connected." Thomas's voice grew softer with memory. "She would give away everything we had if she thought someone needed it more. At first, it frustrated me terribly. I'd save up for months for something, a television, a vacation, and then she'd donate the money to some family in crisis. We'd argue about it, sometimes bitterly, but gradually I realized that her way of living made her deeply, profoundly happy in a way that my accumulation never made me. She had peace that I envied. She had purpose that gave her life meaning. She had relationships that money couldn't buy." Thomas paused, lost in memory, his face illuminated by the setting sun. "When she got sick, when we knew she was dying, I expected her to be afraid or angry or bitter. But she wasn't any of those things. She was at peace, genuinely at peace with her life and her death. And in her final days, she made me promise two things: that I would continue her work of caring for others, and that I would find joy in the giving rather than seeing it as sacrifice. She said something I'll never forget: 'Tomas, everything we've given away is still ours in ways that matter. Everything we've hoarded is already gone.'" "Thomas," Robert said eventually, "I want to do something significant, and I want your blessing before I proceed." "What's that?" Thomas asked with gentle curiosity. "I want to establish a major foundation, a substantial one, dedicated to supporting group homes and foster care facilities across the entire country. Places like Sunshine Home, they're doing absolutely critical work, but are chronically underfunded and undervalued. I'm thinking $200 million to start, with ongoing funding from Chen Technologies profits. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering carefully. That's extraordinarily generous, Robert. But can I ask you something first? Of course. Anything. Why? Is this about feeling good about yourself, about getting your name on buildings and in newspapers, or is it genuinely about helping children? The question was direct, but not accusatory, and Robert appreciated its absolute honesty. 6 months ago, I would have said it was about helping children, but really it would have been about my ego, another accomplishment, another way to be publicly recognized as generous and important, another thing to put on my legacy. Now, I genuinely want to help. These kids deserve so much better than what the system typically gives them. They deserve places like Sunshine Home, where they're actually seen and valued as human beings. And I'm in a unique position to make that happen on a large scale. Then you have my complete blessing and my encouragement, Thomas said warmly. Though I'd strongly suggest you involve Margaret and other directors of similar homes in the planning process. They understand the real needs far better than either of us ever could. Of course, Robert agreed immediately. I've learned at least that much, to listen to people who actually do the work rather than assuming I know best because I have money. 2 years after Robert first saw Thomas feeding a homeless woman in the plaza, Chen Technologies held its annual holiday party. Traditionally, this had been a lavish affair at a downtown hotel that Robert used to impress clients and celebrate the company's success with expensive excess. This year, Robert made a dramatic change. He canceled the expensive venue and instead hosted the party at Sunshine Children's Home. He rented equipment to winterize the outdoor spaces, hired excellent caterers to provide a genuine feast, brought in quality entertainment, and invited not just Chen Technologies employees, but also the children, staff, and families connected to Sunshine Home and the broader Foster Hope Foundation network that now supported 200 facilities nationwide. It was chaotic and imperfect and messy, far removed from the polished corporate events he'd always hosted, but it was also joyful in a way those other parties never had been. Robert stood on the small makeshift stage that evening, looking out at the extraordinary crowd, his employees mingling naturally with foster children, executives playing games with teenagers who'd aged out of the system, Thomas Martinez sitting with a group of younger kids telling his famous stories. The scene was beautiful chaos, and Robert's heart felt fuller than he'd ever thought possible. He cleared his throat to speak, and the room gradually quieted, all eyes turning toward him. 2 years ago, Robert began, his voice carrying emotion he no longer tried to hide. I stood in my office on the 45th floor and looked down at our plaza. I saw one of our employees, Thomas Martinez, give away his dinner and what I later learned was a substantial portion of his paycheck to a homeless woman. It bothered me profoundly, not because it was wrong, but because I couldn't understand it. How could someone with so little give away so much? Robert continued, his eyes finding Thomas in the crowd. I've spent the last 2 years trying to answer that question, and I've learned something profound and life-changing. I was asking entirely the wrong question. The real question isn't how people with little can afford to be generous. The real question is how people with much can possibly afford not to be. He paused, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Thomas, would you please come up here? Thomas looked profoundly uncomfortable, but made his way through the applauding crowd to stand beside Robert, who continued. Thomas has worked for Chen Technologies for 14 years. For 12 of those years, he's given away half his salary, more than $250,000 total of his own money, to support this children's home and the kids here. He's done it quietly, without ever seeking recognition or reward or even acknowledgement. He's done it while living on a salary that barely allows for basic survival in San Francisco, one of America's most expensive cities. The room was completely silent now, everyone's attention focused on this unlikely pair on stage, the billionaire CEO and the janitor who gave away half of almost nothing. Thomas once asked me a question that changed my life. How do you live with so much and give away so little? It was the single most important question anyone has ever asked me. Because the truth is, I spent most of my life accumulating massive wealth while becoming desperately poor in everything that actually matters: relationships, purpose, peace, love, meaning. Meanwhile, Thomas has given away his wealth while becoming genuinely rich in all those same things. Robert turned to face Thomas directly, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "You saved my life, Thomas. Not dramatically. You didn't pull me from a burning building. But you saved me from a kind of death that's slower and quieter and just as deadly. The death of meaning, of purpose, of genuine human connection. You showed me, through your extraordinary example, what it means to live well rather than just live wealthy." Robert handed Thomas the envelope. "This isn't payment for what you've taught me. That would be impossible to repay. This is simply me trying to honor your example by giving from my life and not just my bank account. Inside is a deed to a house, a real house, not an apartment, fully paid for in your name. It's nothing extravagant, just a comfortable 3-bedroom place where you can live out your years without financial stress, with space to host the kids who age out and need somewhere safe to land." Thomas opened the envelope with trembling hands, his eyes widening as he read the document. A house. A real house with his name on the deed. No mortgage, no rent, just his. "Robert, I can't accept this," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "It's far too much. It's nothing compared to what you've given me," Robert replied with absolute conviction. "Thomas, you've given me your time, your wisdom, your example, your friendship. You've asked for absolutely nothing in return. Please, let me do this. Let me give you what you've earned 1,000 times over: security and dignity and a home of your own where you can keep making a difference." Thomas's eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept it," Robert urged gently. "Say you'll finally let someone help you the way you've helped so many others for so many years." Thomas looked out at the crowd, at the children from Sunshine Home who loved him with pure hearts, at the Chen Technologies employees who were seeing him truly for perhaps the first time, and Margaret, whose face was wet with grateful tears, at Robert, who waited with such hope and love in his eyes. "I accept," Thomas said finally, his voice strong despite his tears. "Not for myself. I've been content with little for so long. But so I can do even more. With housing costs eliminated, I can give away maybe 75% of my paycheck now instead of just half. Maybe I can help even more kids, support even more causes, make even more of a difference." 5 years after Robert first witnessed Thomas's act of generosity in the plaza, both men's lives had transformed in profound ways. Robert had stepped down as CEO of Chen Technologies, transitioning to chairman of the board and spending most of his time on philanthropic work through the Foster Hope Foundation. The foundation had grown exponentially, now supporting over 200 facilities across the country, impacting thousands of children's lives through sustainable funding, innovative educational programs, and systemic advocacy for foster care reform. But Robert's proudest achievement wasn't the foundation's impressive scale or its measurable impact. It was the relationships he'd built along the way. The former foster children who called him Uncle Robert with genuine affection. His biological children who had gradually, painfully, beautifully forgiven him and rebuilt genuine connection. His grandchildren who knew their grandfather as someone present and engaged and loving, not distant and preoccupied with work. The network of caregivers, social workers, and advocates who had become true friends and valued colleagues. Thomas Martinez, now 70 years old, had finally agreed to retire from his janitorial position after 45 years of honest labor. Though he continued his sacred Sunday visits to Sunshine Home with religious devotion that never wavered. He lived in the comfortable house Robert had given him, which had become a warm gathering place for young adults aging out of the foster system. Those who needed a safe place, a home-cooked meal, advice from someone who genuinely cared about their futures, a temporary haven while they found their footing in an often harsh world. Robert visited Thomas often at the house, their friendship having deepened into something neither could easily define or categorize. They were from completely different worlds, different generations, different backgrounds and life experiences. Yet they had found in each other something rare and precious. Genuine friendship based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and love that transcended all the barriers that usually divide people. One Sunday afternoon, Robert arrived at Thomas's house to find him in the garden with 3 former foster children, now young adults trying to build independent lives, helping them plant vegetables. Thomas was teaching them about soil preparation and proper plant spacing, but also about patience, about nurturing things that grow slowly, about the deep satisfaction of creating life rather than just consuming it. Robert joined them, getting his hands dirty in a way the old Robert Chen never would have tolerated or understood. They worked together in companionable silence, and Robert reflected on the profound journey that had brought him here. From observing an act of generosity through a distant window to participating fully in a life of generosity himself. You know what's funny? Robert said to Thomas as they washed their hands at the outdoor spigot, dirt swirling down the drain. When I first saw you give away your money and food to that homeless woman, I thought you were foolish, naive, maybe even mentally unstable. I literally couldn't understand why anyone would give away so much when they had so little. It made no rational sense to me. And now, Thomas asked with a knowing smile that carried deep wisdom, now I realize you were the sanest, healthiest person I'd ever encountered. You understood something that all my business degrees and wealth management advisors and success coaches never taught me. That the real purpose of having is giving, that true security comes not from what we hoard, but from the communities we build, that genuine wealth is measured in relationships and impact, not in bank balances and stock portfolios and material possessions. Thomas dried his hands on a towel and handed it to Robert. You've learned well, my friend. But more importantly, you've not just learned it intellectually, you've actually lived it, embodied it, made it central to who you are. That's what truly matters. Anyone can understand generosity as a concept. Living it consistently, practicing it daily, making it fundamental to your identity. That's the real work, and you've done it. Thomas, Robert said as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in magnificent colors. I need to tell you something official. The Chen Technologies board has decided to rename our annual Community Service Award. We're calling it the Thomas Martinez Award for Transformative Generosity. It will go to employees who exemplify the kind of selfless service you've modeled for decades, giving not from surplus but from substance, serving not for recognition but because it's simply right, showing up consistently for people who need presence more than presence. Thomas shook his head with a rueful smile, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. You know, I hate that kind of public recognition, Robert. I know you do, and that's precisely why you deserve it, Robert replied firmly. People desperately need to see that real heroism isn't about grand dramatic gestures or publicized sacrifices. It's about showing up consistently, giving generously, loving freely, all the things you've done quietly for decades while the world ignored you. Your example needs to be celebrated publicly because it challenges everything our culture teaches us about success and worth and what makes a life meaningful. Will you at least let me have input on the selection criteria? Thomas asked with gentle insistence. Of course. Always. Then I want one non-negotiable requirement. That candidates must demonstrate generosity relative to their means, not just in absolute dollar amounts. A janitor giving away 20% of their salary should be valued equally with, or perhaps even more than, an executive giving away 20% of theirs, given the far greater sacrifice involved. Done, Robert agreed immediately. That's absolutely perfect. That's exactly the point we need to make. They sat in comfortable silence as night fell gently, both men reflecting on the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment of friendship and mutual transformation. I nearly missed it entirely, Robert said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. I nearly looked away from my window that night, dismissed what I saw as none of my business, gone back to my financial reports and my empty, successful life. My entire life transformation hinged on a single moment of curiosity, wondering why you were giving away so much when you had so little. If I'd dismissed it, if I'd never investigated, if I'd never come here, if I'd never met you. But you didn't dismiss it. Thomas interrupted gently but firmly. You were curious. You investigated. You came here. You were willing to change. You were humble enough to learn. Those were all choices you made, Robert. Difficult choices. Give yourself appropriate credit for that courage. Still, I'm grateful beyond words. For you, for this place, for everything I've learned, for the person I've been able to become. You gave me back my life, Thomas. You gave me back my soul, my purpose, my ability to love and be loved. Thomas reached over and squeezed Robert's shoulder with affection. You always had your soul, my dear friend. You'd just forgotten how to hear it speaking. Sometimes we all need someone to help us remember who we're truly meant to be, beneath all the noise and expectations and fear. As Robert drove home that night to a smaller, warmer house filled with photos of grandchildren and drawings from Sunshine Home kids, he thought about Thomas's words. He'd always had his soul, just forgotten how to hear it. The deafening noise of achievement and accumulation and success-seeking had drowned out everything else that mattered. Thomas Martinez, with his janitor's salary and his radical generosity and his quiet, consistent love, had turned down the volume on all that noise and helped Robert hear the quiet, persistent voice of his better self. The self that valued people over profits, relationships over achievements, generosity over accumulation, presence over productivity, love over legacy. And Robert had listened, had changed, had become, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely, a fundamentally different kind of man. One who measured wealth differently, who understood success differently, who lived differently, who loved differently. The CEO had learned from the janitor. The billionaire had been taught by the man who gave away half of almost nothing. And in that learning, both men and countless children whose lives they'd touched had been transformed in ways that would echo through generations. It was, Robert thought as he pulled into his driveway and saw his daughter's car there for their weekly dinner, the best deal he'd ever made, though it had nothing to do with business and everything to do with becoming finally and fully, genuinely human.